Loss. No, not that one. The loss of a loved one shatters the foundation of daily life. When someone close dies, the brain struggles to accept the reality of their absence, which is why people often expect to see or hear the deceased in familiar places. Due to the amount of pressure it puts on the mental state and the body, the death of a close loved one can actually increase the risk of heart disease and mortality. The loss creates a deep void in the heart that can eventually be adapted to, but the hole can never be filled. Existential crisis. What's the meaning of life? What's my purpose? These questions can spiral into an existential crisis, a psychological state where one struggles to find meaning in existence.
What is my purpose?
You pass butter.
Oh my god.
It often strikes after major life changes, losing a loved one, a career shift, or even prolonged isolation. The brain craves certainty, and when the foundation of our beliefs is shaken, anxiety and depression follow. Heartbreak. Heartbreak activates the same brain regions as physical pain, which is why it feels like being physically wounded. When a romantic bond breaks, the mind clings to memories, replaying moments, or idealizing what was lost, subsequently making moving on a monumental task. This is because love strengthens neural pathways, making a partner feel essential to survival. The abrupt loss of that connection creates withdrawal-like symptoms, anxiety, depression, and even insomnia. Terminal illness. Few moments in life are as jarring as being told time is running out. The brain's initial response is shock, often followed by denial and bargaining. Psychologists call this anticipatory grief, mourning a future that now feels stolen. Those who focus on purpose, rather than fear, report higher levels of peace in their final days. Betrayal. Betrayal cuts deeper than most emotional wounds because it destroys trust, the foundation of human relationships. Whether it's a cheating partner, a dishonest friend, or a backstabbing colleague, the result is the same. The brain registers it as an attack. It damages a person's ability to trust again, training the brain to expect future deceit. Rejection. Rejection stings because humans are wired for connection. Taking evolution into account, social exclusion from a group could mean death, which is why even minor rejections, like being ignored or dismissed, trigger pain responses in the brain. As time goes on, repeated rejection can lower self-esteem, making future experiences even harder to handle. Getting fired. For many, a career isn't just a paycheck, it's part of their identity. So what happens when that's suddenly taken away? In many cultures, careers define self-worth, making unemployment feel like a personal failure rather than just bad luck or circumstances. The brain responds with a surge of anxiety, as financial instability triggers survival instincts. Prolonged joblessness can even alter cognitive function, reducing motivation and confidence. Isolation. Humans are social creatures, and extended periods of isolation can be as harmful as smoking 15 cigarettes a day. The brain craves connection, and when that need isn't met, stress levels rise. Chronic isolation can lead to cognitive decline, weakened immunity, and increased risk of depression, which is why solitary confinement is considered one of the harshest punishments. Losing a pet. They may be small, but the impact they have on our lives is enormous. So when a pet passes, the grief can be just as overwhelming. Losing a pet can trigger grief levels similar to losing a human loved one, but with less societal support, and the sudden absence of routines, feeding, walking, hearing familiar sounds, amplifies it. Many people end up feeling guilty for mourning, or for not mourning enough. Addiction. Addiction rewires the brain. Substances or behaviors that provide pleasure trigger dopamine surges, reinforcing compulsive use, and over time, the brain begins to require more to feel normal while reducing natural dopamine production. This is why withdrawal is agonizing, both physically and mentally. Addiction isolates, strains relationships, and erodes self-worth, trapping individuals in a cycle of craving and regret. Quitting is easier said than done, as it involves facing the emotional pain that fueled the addiction in the first place. Mental health. Depression, anxiety, OCD, bipolar disorder. Mental health struggles aren't just in the head, they affect the entire body. Chemical imbalances, trauma, or chronic stress can transform the brain's chemistry into making everyday tasks feel impossible. The hardest part is often the invisibility, because unlike a broken bone, there is no obvious wound, leading people to dismiss the suffering. Stigma makes it worse, discouraging people from seeking help. Bullying. Being targeted repeatedly, whether at school, work, or online, reshapes the way a person sees themselves. Over time, persistent bullying erodes self-esteem, and victims may start believing the insults thrown at them. The effects can last for years, even after the bullying stops. And adults who were bullied as children often struggle with trust issues, self-doubt, and depression. Childhood trauma. The brain is most vulnerable during childhood, meaning early trauma leaves lasting marks. Abuse, neglect, or growing up in an unstable environment can transform how a child views the world and relationships, manifesting as hypervigilance, emotional outbursts, and deep-seated trust issues when they are older. Many survivors struggle with self-worth, repeating unhealthy patterns without realizing why. Childhood trauma isn't something people just get over. It embeds itself in the brain. Failure. Realizing life won't turn out the way you imagined is one of the most heart-wrenching life experiences. Whether it's a career that never took off, a passion that faded, or a goal that proved unreachable, the disappointment can feel like a personal failure. Agonizing over something that was meaningful on a personal level, but not recognized by society, is called disenfranchised grief, and the brain cycles through regret, self-doubt, or even resentment as it struggles to adjust to the perceived failure. Separation. Leaving behind a home or loved ones creates a grief rooted in nostalgia and longing. The sense of displacement caused by immigration, estrangement, or circumstances beyond control is an overwhelming feeling. People who move frequently, especially in childhood, struggle more with identity and stability later in life. Familiarity, when stripped away, is followed by anxiety and loneliness, but even if the change is temporary, the emotional toll can be lasting. Poverty. Struggling to afford basic necessities changes the way the brain functions. Unlike other hardships, poverty isn't always temporary. It can feel like a trap with limited opportunities for escape. The pressure to survive often outweighs the ability to plan for the future, creating a cycle of instability. Beyond the material struggles, there's also the stigma. Society often blames the poor for their circumstances, adding shame to an already overwhelming burden. Witnessing trauma. Seeing something horrific firsthand leaves a lasting imprint on the mind. War, accidents, abuse, crime. The brain doesn't easily forget this kind of extreme distress. For some, the experience replays in flashbacks or nightmares, but for others, they shut down emotionally and detach as a survival mechanism. Despite the event not happening directly to them, the brain internalizes the shared fear and helplessness and twists their sense of security. Unfortunately, this means even indirect exposure can lead to long-term psychological scars. Serious injury. Losing the ability to do what once felt effortless is a deep, personal loss. The shift from independence to limitation caused by a sudden accident or gradual decline can be devastating. The body may heal, but the psychological adjustment is often harder. Many experience grief over lost abilities, social isolation due to inaccessibility, or frustration at a world designed for the able-bodied. The hardest part is accepting that life is now divided into before and after. Discrimination. Discrimination physically and mentally wears people down. Those who experience long-term discrimination have higher levels of stress hormones, increasing their risk of heart disease, anxiety, and depression. Implicit bias means people often don't realize they're contributing to it, making it harder to combat. The brain then internalizes discrimination over time, leading to something called stereotype threat, where the discriminated begin to feel that they are perpetrating negative stereotypes about their minority group. Homelessness. Job loss, medical debt, and mental health struggles are the leading causes of homelessness. The psychological toll is immense, with chronic stress, sleep deprivation, and social isolation creating a cycle that's difficult to escape. The longer someone is homeless, the harder it becomes to reintegrate into society, and getting a job or government assistance becomes nearly impossible. Worst of all, the general public often looks the other way, so the warmth of human connection needed for survival is scarce. Abuse. Repeated abuse, both emotional and physical, forces the body into a constant state of fight or flight, flooding it with stress hormones. Over time, this can lead to anxiety, depression, and even physical health issues. Emotional abuse is just as damaging as physical abuse, often leaving invisible scars that affect self-worth and trust, and survivors may struggle with shame, self-blame, or dissociation as a coping mechanism. False accusation. Even after being proven innocent, the falsely accused struggle with damaged reputations, lost relationships, and lingering trauma. The presumption of innocence often collapses under public opinion, making it nearly impossible to fully recover. Psychological research also shows that once people believe something about someone, even irrefutable evidence struggles to change their minds.